set it up again. All right, so we're looking still at the foundational rules, the foundational guidelines. So the first two rules consist of the direction of the soul is taking, right? The third and the fourth rules consist of the two basic spiritual movements in the soul. So there are two basic spiritual movements: spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. Spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. This is very important. We should expect in our spiritual life spiritual consolations. We should expect in our spiritual life times of spiritual desolation. That's not the problem. The problem would be not to be aware, not to understand these movements, and hence not taking the proper action. This is why rules number 3 and number 4 are so key, because they help us be aware and understand these two basic spiritual movements. Rule number 3 is on spiritual consolation. The third is of spiritual consolation. I call it consolation when some interior movement is caused in the soul, through which the soul comes to be inflamed with love of its Creator and Lord. And consequently, when it can love no created thing on the face of the earth in itself, but only in the Creator of them all. Likewise, when it sheds tears that move to love of its Lord, whether out of sorrow for one's sins, or for the passion of Christ our Lord, or because of other things directly ordered to his service and praise. Finally, I call consolation every increase of hope, faith, charity, in all interior joy that calls and attracts the heavenly things into salvation of one's soul, quieting it and giving it peace in its Creator and Lord. The first thing that we need to do to understand spiritual consolation is to distinguish between spiritual consolation and non-spiritual consolation. Non-spiritual consolation can have physical, bodily, psychological causes. Okay? When Father Isidore eats pancit, it's his favorite Filipino food. Non-spiritual consolation. He goes from Father Isidore to Father Isidorable. He's just so happy at that point. He's like in the Philippines again. Non-spiritual consolation. Spiritual consolation is directly and immediately in reference to our life of faith, to our spiritual life, to our prayer life. Faith, hope, charity. So the first thing we need to do is to distinguish between spiritual consolation and non-spiritual consolation, because they have different causes, right? They come from different causes. That said, we also need to be aware and understand that they can and do often overlap. Here's an example. Here's my little sister, Sister Saint Therese. There was an incident in her life that her sister, Pauline, so the top right, she is a top right. She's her blood sister, but also sister in religion, the religious life. Sister Pauline, so the sister on the top right, she explains an incident that happened in the life of Saint Therese. She says, descending the steps leading into the garden, She saw a little white hen under a tree, protecting her little chicks under her wings. Some were peeping out from under. Therese stopped, looking at them thoughtfully. After a while, I made a sign that we should go inside. I noticed her eyes were filling with tears, and I said, "You're crying." She put her hand over her eyes and cried even more. I can't explain it just now. I'm too deeply touched. That evening in her cell, she told me the following, and there was a heavenly expression on her face. Now, St. Therese explains to her sister what happened. I cried when I thought how God used this image in order to teach us his tenderness toward us. All through my life, this is what he has done for me. He has hidden me under his wings. Earlier in the day, when I was leaving you, I was crying when going upstairs. I was unable to control myself any longer, and I hastened to our cell. My heart was overflowing with love and gratitude. You see how St. Therese went from non-spiritual consolation to spiritual consolation. She saw those little chicks and how they were protected under the wing, right? And that consoled her, just that image itself. And immediately her thoughts and her affections went to God, the Father, who did the same thing in her life, who protected her under his wings. And what happened? Her heart was overflowing with love and gratitude. From non-spiritual consolation to spiritual consolation. You see, they are distinct, but they can and do often overlap. So when it comes to spiritual consolation, there are different forms of spiritual consolation. They can differ in intensity. It can be gentle or stronger. And it can differ in duration. It can be very brief, a touch, or it can be longer. What's important to note is spiritual consolation is always very personal. Our Lady gives this according to your personal capacity and to your personal personality, right? St. Therese was a girl. She was a woman. So she was moved by chicks. The guys would never be moved by chicks, by hens, right? Maybe something else needs to move us. Something else, but not like little hens and chicks. You see how it's different, right? Our Lady gives spiritual consolation according to her child, according to the capacity of her child. Why is this important? This rule is important because it helps us recognize spiritual consolation. And spiritual consolation, get this now, always comes from God, from Our Lady. And since it comes from God and Our Lady, then we need to accept it. Okay, that is a proper action. Let's look at the fourth rule. The fourth rule is of spiritual desolation. I call desolation all the contrary of the third rule, such as darkness of soul, disturbance in it, movement to low and earthly things, disquiet from various agitations and temptations, moving to lack of confidence, without hope, without love, finding oneself totally slothful, tepid, sad, and as if separated from one's Creator and Lord. For just as consolation is contrary to desolation, in the same way the thoughts that come from consolation are contrary to the thoughts that come from desolation. St. Ignatius is often complicated and dense, but his essential teaching is very clear. The first thing we need to do for spiritual desolation as well is to distinguish spiritual desolation from non-spiritual desolation. Non-spiritual desolation can come from physical, bodily, or psychological factors and causes. When we have a bad day, we have just a bad mood, we're frustrated, we are in non-spiritual desolation, we're frazzled, right? These are non-spiritual desolations, forms of non-spiritual desolation. Spiritual desolation always immediately refers to our life of faith, our prayer life, our spiritual life. Before we look at this example, again, we distinguish them, but we also have to add that they can and do often overlap. The evil one can use that space of non-spiritual desolation. So a petty argument, frustration, bad mood. The evil one can use that space of non-spiritual desolation to bring you to spiritual desolation. So first, distinguish them, but also be aware and understand that they can and do often overlap. The initial apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima to the three children, they had no doubt. The three children had no doubt that what they were seeing was supernatural. But at the home, it was different. Lucia says, I began then to have doubts as to whether these manifestations might be from the devil, who was seeking by these means to make me lose my soul, as I heard people say that the devil always brings conflict and disorder. I began to think that truly, ever since I had started seeing these things, our home was no longer the same, for joy and peace had fled. What anguish I felt. From non-spiritual desolation, petty arguments in the house, she was moved to spiritual desolation. She began having doubts of the apparitions and the supernatural character of those apparitions. Some of the essential characteristics of spiritual desolation is that when we are in spiritual desolation interprets our spiritual past. You remember your life when you were at that age. Remember what you did. Remember how you continue to do that, how you fell into that sin. Goes to the past. It also predicts our spiritual future. Who are you trying to strive for holiness? You will never make it. What is this plan of life? That is so dumb. You will never be consistent with that. What's the point of that? You're trying to deepen your prayer. Do you think you will persevere? Just give up now. You're not going to make it. Predicts our spiritual future. And ultimately, it presents itself as our spiritual identity. It goes to the past. It paints it in a bleak picture. It goes to the future. It paints that in the bleak picture. And in the present moment, we are completely paralyzed. It has quality to it. It also adds a sense of shame. I can't believe you did that. Oh my goodness. It adds a sense of isolation. No one else is like you. You're so stupid. You're the only one that does this. And then it adds a sense of irreparable damage. You are completely broken. You're a wretched individual. Spiritual desolation is very harmful if we let it drag us down, you see. It has a paralyzing quality. Little by little, it drags us down. And if we do not reject it, it will paralyze us and we will not move forward in doing the will of God. That's not the problem, though. In fact, we need to expect times of spiritual desolation. That's not the problem. The problem is not being aware, not understanding, and hence, ultimately, not taking the proper action against spiritual desolation. That is dangerous. Why? Because again, it has a paralyzing quality. And the fact is, we all of us here, will experience times of spiritual desolation. Just like spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation also has different intensities. It can be gentle, it can be stronger, and it also can vary in duration. It can be very brief, it can be longer. Rule number 4 consists of how to recognize spiritual desolation. So for St. Ignatius, rules number 3 and 4 is the two basic spiritual movements of the soul, of the heart. Spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. Spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. This is something that we need to expect in our spiritual life. Ups, downs. Ups, downs. What our Lord and our Lady expect from us is throughout the ups, throughout the downs, that we remain faithful. St. Ignatius says that one of them he gives, spiritual consolation. The other he permits, spiritual desolation. Key, spiritual consolation comes from God and Our Lady. He gives those, so we need to accept it. The other, spiritual desolation, he permits. It always comes from the evil one, and hence we need to reject it.